Hello, everyone. Good evening. And thank you so much for joining us live. And then those of you joining us later in the archives, we appreciate it. We know you have lots of options for virtual events, and we don't take that for granted. We really appreciate it. Welcome, and thank you for supporting Book Passage and awesome events like tonight. I'm your host, Paula Farmer, and you have entered to what I think is going to be one of our most interesting and important conversations with authors events. I admit I might be a little bit biased because I had a hand in bringing our two guests together for this. And I've been reading both books, as you should too. And when you do, get it through Book Passage. More on that later. But before we officially dive into the introductions and the event, I want to remind you that we love it when you actively participate in the event by putting comments and questions into the chat. I promise you our authors will get to your questions at some point in the discussion. And our featured book right here by J. David McSwane is Pandemic Inc., Chasing Capitalists, the Capitalists and Thieves Who Got Rich While We Got Sick. As he even admits, that main title might be off-putting given all we've been through in the last couple of years and still going through for many, many people. But there's nothing depressing about this book. And his intention is not to set off any kind of pandemic COVID triggers. He would rather set off a righteous anger in us through this brilliant nonfiction thriller, taking us behind the scenes to reveal how traders, contractors, and healthcare companies used one of the darkest moments in American history to fill their pockets. McSwane is a reporter in ProPublica's DC office. Previously, he was an investigative reporter for the Dallas Morning News and the Austin American Statesman. His reporting has spurred news laws, state and federal criminal investigation, and forced belt-tightening lawmakers to invest in social programs. Not surprising, he has won many awards. In conversation with him is Peter S. Goodman, whose new book, Davos Man, How Billionaires Devoured the World, is equally absorbing and maddening in a good way. He is the global economics correspondent for the New York Times, based in New York. Over the course of 3 decades in journalism, Goodman has covered some of the most monumentous economic transformations and upheavals, including the 2008 crash and emergence of China into global superpower. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Peter's very capable hands and have them take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. I personally come from the school of journalism that says if we're not trying to outrage people, then we're missing the story of our time. And in that context, I'm grateful for David's book. It's really required reading, not to say that it's a take your medicine book. It is quite gripping, but it's necessary reading for those of us trying to make sense of this extraordinary, tragic period that we have lived through and are still, unfortunately, living through. With that in mind, David, tell us what compelled you to write this book? And, was there a moment in your reporting on these grifters and con artists where you thought to yourself, this is bigger than just the story I'm working on, this is a book?
I have to admit, I didn't set out to write a book. I just ended up with this really unique view and front row seat to really just absurd behavior during this period that we all suffered through. So I was reporting it out for ProPublica, and we had a series of stories just sort of letting people who are stuck at home know that this madness is happening. And, an agent actually reached out to me and said, do you think it could be a book? And I said, I have no idea. But as I kept reporting, I realized, it is a bit of a quest story, in search of answers. And I was already reporting these stories in first person because it was so bizarre that I thought, I think we can tell a tale here of a really disastrous failure in an important place and time.
What is that big question that you found yourself chewing on, as you decided you were putting a book together?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, what is the ultimate question that you're trying to make sense of for us in terms of, the way the federal government succeeded or failed, or the nature of power in our society?
Yeah, I wanted to understand how the, most powerful nation on earth had so abysmally failed, and why on earth were we reliant on these mercenaries, people coming out of the woodwork trying to make a buck over our suffering. And, you start with just sort of a few characters realizing this wacky stuff's going on. And I wanted to get to the root of it and hopefully lay out a blueprint of exactly what not to do if we end up in such a crisis in the future.
One of the things that I was most struck by in the setup of your narrative was your treatment of how lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, multiple presidential administrations, participated in cutting down the strategic reserve of PPE, of protective gear in the pandemic, such that we essentially found ourselves relying on the patchwork, as you put it, the mercenaries, but also a bunch of philanthropists, all sorts of cockamamie ideas. The U.S. became essentially a beggar nation in the worst pandemic in a century. Tell us that story. How did lawmakers and presidential administrations manage to blow it in terms of this strategic reserve?
Yeah, I wish I'd thought of beggar nation. I could have got that in the book. Well, yeah, it was actually, a simple question. When the pandemic hit, we had something like 1% of what we needed in terms of gloves and masks and other PPE. And it was just an astounding failure. There was this, congressional hearing where Mitt Romney was beside himself trying to understand how that happened. And when you look into it, the answer is almost always money in politics. And it really went back to 2010, 2011, and 2012, that sort of Tea Party wave, and the Republican determination to fight everything that President Barack Obama and his administration wanted to do. So they focused in on health and human services, which was overseeing the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, which they were determined to hobble. And deep down in the weeds, in those budget lines, is the Strategic National Stockpile, CDC, other really important functions that most of us don't think about. And as the Tea Party forced budget cuts, threatened the debt ceiling, the Obama administration had to figure out where to spread the pain. So we stopped spending in the stockpile. And what money we did have started to, was more focused on bioterrorism. So the answer was pretty simple. Our nasty politics contributed to us not being ready, and both parties own some responsibility for that. And I felt it was important to point out because everyone's very ready to lay everything at the Trump administration's feet. But as with everything, it's usually a little more complicated.
Well, one of the things I find most striking about that bit of history, though, is the Tea Party, of course, does help deliver Donald Trump. And Donald Trump then delivers the largest package of tax cuts in American history, most of them lavished on, the people I write about in my book, Davos man. I mean, corporate executives, the 0.1% of 1%. How is it that we seem to always have money for tax cuts for billionaires, but we don't have money for things like surgical masks and gowns for frontline medical workers in the pandemic? Is it a question of just basic competence? Is it that we're not listening to epidemiologists who, at least, in the wilderness, are warning that we better be prepared for something like this? Is it just this kind of naked belief in trickle-down economics, and we put faith in the idea that if rich people have more, then we'll all have more? How do both parties fail to marshal a stockpile?
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, so there's the basic hypocrisy of the Republicans saying one thing when their guy's in power, and then another thing when a Democratic president is in power, right? I mean, and things were really intensifying first under the Obama administration. This is like, post Sarah Palin Tea Party stuff. And the truth is, we did have money. I mean, we can be prepared. We can absolutely do it. And in fact, George W. Bush really saw that. And, of course, post 9/11, really wanted us to be ready for the next pandemic. The Obama administration put together a playbook, which the Trump administration threw out. But it really just came down to politics and the optics of, smaller government. We're cutting it down. And this was sort of an unforeseen casualty. And it occurred at the same time that we were kind of taking the threat for granted. I mean, this wasn't just foreseen. It was like prophesized. When you look at some of the government reports, I described this in the book, they said we will be fighting over N95s. We need a stockpile. States need a stockpile. There's going to be confusion about who needs masks. When I read some of those reports, just as an American, I was pissed off. I couldn't believe it. And we just didn't heed those warnings because politics.
It's chilling. One of the most interesting parts of your book for me was reading this very granular but very fascinating accounting of what the Trump administration did to then try to catch up, to get enough ventilators, to build up the stocks of PPE. And the most interesting figure for me is Peter Navarro, who was, Trump's chief trade advisor, who's the author of a book called Death by China, whose brand is, China is trying to destroy us. We're locked in a zero-sum game with China. Your accounting of Navarro seems somewhat ambiguous. On the one hand, you sort of give him props for being willing to consider doing whatever it takes once we're in a crisis to get our hands on PPE. But you also accuse him of breaking traditional procurement rules. Like, flesh out for us how you view Navarro in that period.
I really wanted to talk to Peter Navarro, and he knew I was interested because I actually did some reporting as congressional things came out. I just found him a fascinating character, just as a writer and as a reporter. And, he's not a very popular figure in Washington, D.C. And some people here have been like, well, it seemed like you were, you almost had a soft spot for him. And I said, no, absolutely not. I just found it fascinating that here's this guy who I describe as the Nicolas Cage of American politics. He got some things right and he was trying to do it, but he's an eccentric and doesn't care. He's willing to flout the rules and, steer contracts to friends and ignore science and peddle things like hydroxychloroquine. He just seemed to be a little more complex than we give him credit for. There's sort of this caricaturization of DC figures such as him, and it's kind of his own doing. But I found it fascinating. He's one of the first people in the Trump administration to take the threat seriously. He's trying to get things moving in what he called Trump time, which is silly because they were ignoring the pandemic. And he clearly grew frustrated that the Trump administration wasn't doing more. And yet he's one of the more absurd Trump lieutenants. So when you look at just the basic question of supplies and, these contracts that I end up following, just really absurd things, he was kind of the man with the starting gun. He set off a lot of stuff and he almost succeeded at some things in becoming something of a hero, at least, maybe in some people's eyes. But in the end, I saw him as a tragic figure who's, his personality and his politics and his sort of goofy China hatred just got in the way. And at the end of the day, he was, sadly, our best shot within the Trump administration. So I felt it was important to focus on him.
Let me just push back on that a little bit, if I may. I mean, here's Navarro, who's not only tasked with figuring out how to catch up in terms of the preparedness for the pandemic, but he's the architect of Trump's trade war, whose central target is China, which not coincidentally is the country that makes most of the stuff that we need to buy in the middle of the pandemic, for better or worse. This is not year zero. That's the state of play. I mean, to what extent should we blame Navarro for ginning up a trade war with the country that we're dependent on for life-saving material.
I mean, while it's true that his trade war was, incredibly damaging for everybody involved, and we're paying the price, I don't know if we could assume that China would have kept exports and been our best pal in this event. And in fact, a lot of people had predicted, including Mike Bowen, one of the mask manufacturers here in the U.S., who I talk about in the book. He said China, we're relying on China and they're going to choke off supply. And though Navarro is a fanatic about his sort of anti-China rhetoric, I mean, he wasn't wrong that our reliance on China for these supplies and, pharmaceuticals, frankly, could pose a problem. So he was really jacked up on this. Like, you filter his ideology through the current moment and our reliance on China. He was a little over the top, but, I don't know. Can we blame him for China holding back all those masks? I don't know if we could do that.
Tell us about the CARES Act. So here's this, piece of legislation, $2.2 trillion spent in the name of rescuing us from the pandemic. To what extent does it succeed? What are its strengths? What are its shortcomings? I mean, if we're in this situation again, what should we take away from our experience of the CARES Act in terms of formulating the next rescue?
So the CARES Act, I mean, it was necessary and, it needed to be done. But because we were so ill prepared and we don't have a very good just infrastructure for delivering direct welfare and help to businesses and people, it was a mess and was bound to be picked over by fraudsters. We needed to rush money out fast. So expedience took precedent over due diligence within every program. The Paycheck Protection Program, we're now trying to catch up to a bunch of unemployment fraud. The money for purchasing supplies, there was no oversight. I mean, it was just panic, and we did what America does, and we threw money at it. So it'd be nice to think in the future we would have listened in early January, as soon as the threat appeared, and maybe Congress could have put a little more thought into how those programs actually work.
And what would that thought have looked like? Like if we had it to do over again and we put more thought into it, what would we do differently?
Yeah, it's hard to say because it is, it's an all hands on deck. We're in a lot of trouble situation, but I think there are a few, you can obviously put safeguards around the contracting and say, we're not just going to give everyone with an LLC a contract. Here's a process. We're going to have it in place. And, we have a few weeks and months to prepare. With the Paycheck Protection Program, there are guidelines that you could, guardrails you could put in place with lenders to make sure that they're not giving money to Marriott when, your barber down the street is losing his business. None of that was baked in there. There was really very little to safeguard taxpayers and prevent this sort of graft.
Well, so that's really the meat of your book. I mean, if you think about the Paycheck Protection Program, I mean, I'd love you to tell the story of Don's sister Nino, whose story you tell at some length, and what's the significance of that tale?
Well, I picked on him because he's a character, but a lot of people, I think we've had something like 500 people charged with crimes as a result of Paycheck Protection Program scams. So this was billions of dollars. It's a $800 billion program, largely forgivable loans, comes out in two waves. In that first wave, those who had existing relationships with banks fared well and were able to get this money, which was meant to keep businesses open and employees paid so that they can pay the rent and feed their kids. But a couple lies on two forms, and you could get $1 million in 3 days later. I mean, it was that loosey-goosey, and people bought yachts and mansions. Don's sister Nino was a guy who, former actor. He had, a credit on one, ER show in the 90s, had a dormant media company. He simply resurrects the company, according to his indictment, and says he has, the number escapes me, but it says he has a ton of employees. So he has this big paycheck obligation. He is accused of using social security numbers for employees who didn't exist, and, gets $7 million in a couple days, goes and buys a Lincoln Navigator, pays off his wife's car, pays off a bunch of debt, and ends up buying a mansion outside of Orlando with, just extreme opulence. Really just, the Florida myth. Well, he ends up going on the lam and is found in Croatia, where he tells a judge in Croatia, well, I left because under the Trump administration, what I was doing was okay, but under the Biden administration, they were going to come after me, which I thought said something about just sort of the mentality under the Trump administration that a lot of people who engaged in this sort of behavior saw. They were taking signals from, the leader of the free world, who has a long history of, fraud and swindling allegations. So that's why I picked on him. I found that interesting.
Hey, I just want to pause for a second and tell everybody, please fire away with questions that might be coming to mind in the chat, and we'll get to those later on. Some are starting to filter in, which is great, but don't be shy about questions. So just carrying on in that vein, I mean, the heart of your book is the incredible story of Robert Stewart and how you end up on this private jet that is bound to go pick up some masks that don't actually exist. Tell us, how did you stumble into this story? And then tell us the story.
Stumble is the right word. So, March, April 2020, this was the first time every journalist in the world is on the same story. 9/11 happened, but like sports went on, education went on, like this was everything. So I was trying to find my place in that coverage. I'm new at ProPublica, new to DC, which is a tough town to just hop into. And just decided, I'd covered contracts at the state and local level quite a bit. I'm going to fall back on that. There's a ton of money coming out of DC. Let's figure out who they're paying. I teamed up with a couple colleagues, including Derek Willis, who's really great with data. And I said, let's, split this up, pick it over. And I was immediately drawn to the Veterans Administration's contracts because they oversee the largest hospital network in the country, and looked at their top guy, $34.5 million to this guy, Robert Stewart Jr. And I just started doing the due diligence, a scrub as we call it. And he had no footprint. He'd never had a federal contract. It's for 6 million N95s, which no one seems to be able to get. And I was like, who the hell is this guy? So I was like, you know what? And I picked over his website. I was like, screw it. I'm just going to call him. So I called him up. He's irritated because the Wall Street Journal beat me to a story, mentioned him in an article. And I said, well, how do you have these masks, man? That's amazing. And he says, I'm the real deal. I'm legitimate. I'm hopping on a private jet in the morning to go oversee the masks. And like right away, reporter brain, excuse me, can I join you on this jet? And I think he wanted to prove that he had nothing to hide for reasons I'll never really understand. But, hours later, I'm on a private jet. I took some negotiating with my bosses at ProPublica. They were pretty worried about it because this is when everything's locked down. I mean, No one's flying right now. And it's literally as we're taking off, he reveals, I don't actually have the masks. They were bought out from under me. But he starts describing this underworld of mask brokers and investors and all these people sort of taking their vig on these contracts that are flowing out of the state and federal governments that are panic buying. And I realized this is a much bigger story. There's a moment here and we are in trouble, and states are competing with each other for the same supplies. And underneath all of that chaos are these guys signing NDAs and, making millions of dollars. So it really set me off on a year and a half of reporting, just trying to get to the bottom of that.
And how does the pot business end up sitting at the intersection of, these mask con artists and legal distribution of pot. Tell us about Juanita Ramos.
Yeah. When I started to see the trend of the ganjapreneurs, I just rolled my eyes. I was like, you got to be kidding me. I'm from Colorado and had covered the legalization movement there in a lot of these companies. And I was like, these are people who inhabit a world that overnight went from being illegal to legitimate. And I started just talking to some people. I was like, why are people in the weed business getting involved in this? And it's because they live in this no man's land where it's legal in many states, but the federal government's still illegal. So they're used to working, they're used to transactions involving private investors and putting money into escrow accounts. And they have a tangential relationship with medical supply. They bring in stuff from China, especially the medical marijuana. And, just saw that there were a few people in this world. And I didn't know at the time that Juanita Ramos had anything to do with that. Juanita Ramos, it's mentioned to me when I'm on this caper with Robert Stewart, first to Georgia and then to Chicago. He says, we're going to get this deal done. I'm going to get an extension. We have an in with the White House, this Juanita Ramos, who has a connection to Mike Pence. And he's mentioning Juanita Ramos in his letters to the VA asking for an extension. He gets a congresswoman to invoke Juanita Ramos. And, there's this scene where they're talking and putting on this show and the masks don't materialize while we're in Chicago. And I go back to my room and I start doing, I do all of the standard searches across databases trying to find out who the hell Juanita Ramos is. I don't figure it out. So I have to publish the story and say, the White House doesn't know who Juanita Ramos is. So it becomes sort of this meme. It's like a mystery on Twitter. And I didn't get answers. But a friend of mine sent a text. And he's not a journalist. He works at REI. It says, Juanita Ramos is either a stripper in Atlanta or a Native American medicine woman. And I just thought, okay, whatever, dude. And then moved on. And a few months go by and someone finds the article and sends me an email and says, hey, I dealt with a Juanita Ramos here in Kansas. She was trying to help us get masks. And I was like, holy crap, she's real. And she gives me a cell phone number. So before I call, I cross-reference the cell phone number and up pops this image of a Native American medicine woman named Juanita Ramos. And I just couldn't believe it. It was embarrassing. I don't know how he found her and I didn't. But I called her up and I was like, hey, I've been thinking about you. She's like, what? I was like, do you have a connection to the Mike Pence task force? She's like, hell no, I don't even like Mike Pence. I'm in the weed business. And I told my editor, I was like, all right, I got to go meet Juanita Ramos. And she was in Seattle when we talked, but we ended up meeting in Austin, Texas, where I'd been a reporter for a while. And it was just a trip to finally get to the bottom of it and realize who this woman is.
Help us with the big picture. I mean, in any time there's, in this case, trillions of dollars changing hands, as you were saying before, this is an emergency. This is an economic emergency. Yeah. It's primarily a healthcare emergency. We're moving money out the door. There's going to be some scammers, con artists, grifters. I mean, you're like moths to the flame.
Absolutely.
To what extent is that just the cost of a giant federal operation, as opposed to a sign that there's, an undue amount of corruption in our system that should trouble us in terms of just the basic efficiency of government, to say nothing of the justice? Should we view this as the reliable cast of characters show up, or is this something bigger and different than that?
It is something bigger. It's human nature. As a reporter, the moment I saw that we're going to be spending emergency money, people are going to take advantage of this. It was no question. It's human nature. And as Americans, we have a rich history of that. The False Claims Act stems from the same type of fraud that occurred during the Civil War. This is the country that gave us snake oil salesmen. You expect a certain amount of that. But when you combine our failure to prepare, and then you add the Trump administration's irresponsible decision to downplay the virus and not get ahead of it. And our national response becomes, we're just going to throw money wherever indiscriminately and see what comes back. You just put jet fuel on something that was already going to exist. But it became huge. I mean, this is unprecedented. The DOJ just said we are dealing with unprecedented fraud in the unemployment and the paycheck protection programs. And you saw it with contractors as well. So I think I would have had a story in any other time under any administration, but this was so bananas, just weird behavior that was really spawned by our lack of preparation, poor governance, a vacuum of leadership, and a shitload of money.
I'm curious to know how that reporting affected you personally. I mean, you've spent a lot of your career digging into various, unethical, illegal behavior. Did this reporting change in any fundamental way the way in which you see our system?
Yeah. So, I have a lot of colleagues who were really in the trenches. They were in the nursing homes and, then George Floyd protests. And, I don't think I could argue that I'm that I'm as disillusioned as they may be. But I will say, though, investigative reporters are sort of naturally cynical. We expect some of the worst behavior. It's job security, if you will. It was far worse than I imagined. The closer I got to it, the more discouraged I was about our government. I thought, there's always stories about government waste, right? That's always there. But I thought, it's a vast federal bureaucracy. The inertia of that surely should keep the politics from completely dismantling just basic governance. And Michael Lewis had warned about this in his book, The Fifth Risk.
Right.
And I had read that. So I had that in mind, but I was like, I still had some faith in our institutions. And I have to admit, as cynical as I was, I walked away yet more disillusioned about that. And I think we need to think about, how do we remove politics from the basic work of how the government responds to an emergency? And I don't quite know the answer to that. But it was worse than I imagined. And, there were times where just as an American, I was depressed about it,
I mean, at the risk of talking my own book, I tend to see things through the lens of pillaging by the billionaire class, which has left government just woefully unprepared. And it's left our healthcare system unprepared. We've taken capacity out of the system. We've turned running hospitals, running epidemiological response to this pandemic into something that's not all that different from how, airlines try to maximize revenue from available seats. So, I tend to see things through the lens of scarcity. But your book is really interesting in that it sort of takes the scarcity as the jumping off point. We get into the politics of how we end up with no stockpile, but you're getting deeper into the nature of how government functions. Is that corruption / incompetence? Is that itself a result of scarcity, of institutions not having enough resources to do a proper job? Or is there something deeper in how we actually attack problems in America that gives rise to corruption opportunities for people positioned?
Yeah. That's a complex question. I would say, yes, that's some of it. And, I narrowly tailored the focus of this book for a reason. When I told people I'm working on a book about pandemic profiteers, they said like Jeff Bezos. And I was like, not exactly. Like, I know what you're saying, but I'm not doing a takedown on capitalism. I'm not talking political economic theory. We're really just talking about how we behaved in a time when, if you believed in the World War II America that we were taught, we really should have come together. And we didn't come together. And it's partly because of that scarcity you're talking about that's baked in, but it's also our nasty politics. I could have written a separate book just about how COVID exposed every inequality in our system and why that is. But that's not what this book was about. So I try to, I keep it in mind. I add that context, but I really wanted to put people up close to just how poorly this went and how stupidly we behaved. And I realized in my first reporting with ProPublica that the mask was my entree into that, because it's the symbol of our time. And we've all had to wear those damn things for more than 2 years now.
Right.
We're never going to forget it. And there was so much madness around it. So I really use that as a device to get into a lot of what you're talking about.
You do, though, go hard at the end of the book on some of the big, deep-pocketed players, specifically pharmaceutical companies, who capitalize on publicly financed research and make themselves richer. Tell us how we should view. I mean, I think a lot of us are grateful to Pfizer and Moderna for, showing us some outlines of the end of this disaster. How should we, in the context of your book, view those companies and BioNTech and their executive class?
Yeah, they represent the deeper questions about our system, right? Our brand, or the American brand of capitalism, and how we do things here. I didn't want to get into that and start bringing in economists or whatever, but I just thought we all got the vaccine. Let me just tell you how these people got rich off of what should have been, there was no Jonas Salk in this scenario, right? This should have been a public good. And those companies did give something that have saved lives. I'm very grateful for my 3 Pfizer jabs. But the larger question of, should we enrich these companies with these many billions and billions of dollars and allow their executives to cash out on taxpayer money with stock buybacks? I think we need to ask those questions, because we're going to be beholden to these companies, maybe in perpetuity, as we deal with more variants and we need more boosters. And frankly, the American taxpayer has some ownership of the mRNA vaccine, because that research was funded in large part with taxpayer dollars, but we're not really getting a very good deal. So that chapter's a little, most of the book is very clear. These people behaved badly and there were consequences, and we lost time when time meant American lives. The vaccines chapter is a little bit more ambivalent, because we got something out of it and it's extremely valuable to us. And what is the price tag?
We got some questions from the audience, so let's go to some of those. Great. Anita asks, is it true that Obama warned specifically about a possible pandemic and offered to navigate the process?
It is true that Trump inherited from the Obama administration a playbook, a very detailed playbook, which is now public, and the Trump administration threw it out. And the Obama administration, I talked to some people that were right at the forefront of the swine flu H1N1 epidemic in 2009 and 2010. Though they didn't fight tooth and nail as maybe they should have for stockpile funding, they took pandemics very seriously. I mean, they were scared about it. I mean, people forget that the Obama administration saw the Zika virus. There was that near Ebola outbreak. This was an administration that took it seriously, and they gave the Trump administration everything they needed to handle it. And that administration didn't take expertise and governance seriously and threw it out, and we all paid the price. Sorry, that was long-winded, but yes.
No, that's right on point. Here's Derek asks. He says, "I'm mad already in being reminded of the issues we knew about, like the lack of preparation, let alone other things that have come up in this talk. But what do we do with this information and our outrage?"
Well, who you vote for matters. So think about that, whatever your views. At the very least, we need people in leadership who take these things seriously and understand that governance, by and large, that the government is there to protect, Americans. As for what to do with your anger, I mean, I think everyone in this country should be pissed off right now, and hopefully we can gear that towards putting pressure on our leaders to better prepare. Right now, Congress is fighting over the budget, and the president has called for $88 billion to be poured into Health and Human Services apparatus, which includes the stockpile, things like that. So you can send a letter to your congressman. I would like to add that the book is not all anger. I mean, as you're reporting, you end up in goofy scenarios. Juanita Ramos offered me marijuana when we were talking, and these various absurd things I found. I decided to, it was a tall order because this is about COVID-19 and we're all traumatized. But I decided to include the humor because we need that, and humanity is not just one thing. We have a textured society. And so I think you might be pissed off as you read it, but you might also get a kick out of some of the bizarre things I encountered.
Hey, I'm just going to abuse my prerogative as moderator and eject the follow up. So, I think you're appropriately tough on Trump and the Trump administration, on all sorts of issues, but I'm specifically thinking about vaccine and equitable vaccine distribution. Shouldn't we also be pretty tough on Biden, who's now owned this pandemic for long enough to have used, your point about ownership, public ownership of Moderna's IP, but also having a say about the pricing and availability of Pfizer to get more of these vaccine doses into the bloodstreams of the rest of humanity? And to what extent can we pin some blame on the Biden administration for perpetuating monopoly profits for the pharmaceutical industry, an industry that has historically been very generous to a politician named Joe Biden, where the rest of us are essentially paying through variants and the extended pandemic?
Absolutely. The book takes us through it ends around the fall of 2021 as Delta is emerging. So I don't get into as much of that, but the Biden administration really screwed up on betting everything on vaccines. They underestimated vaccine hesitancy, and that's a messaging problem. And we have misinformation and Fox News and all, we could talk about that, but they should have also done what Europe did and really invest in rapid testing, because Europe didn't have the same access that we did to the vaccines as early. So they bet on testing. We should have done both. And the lack of testing really dragged this thing out and made it even worse through the holidays. And we're still dealing with it now. We are catching up somewhat. There's that. And yeah, I would like to see more accountability of the pharmaceutical companies. I would like to see more discussion of what should be in the public ownership. I'd like to see a vaccine that we're not paying billions and billions of dollars for in perpetuity. There is politics involved in that. I do know the National Institutes of Health has claimed some ownership of the mRNA patents. There's a few patents involved, and they are looking at that.
Okay. Got time for a couple of questions from the audience. Paul Hennessy asks, I definitely understand the political graft angle here, but wonder what was going on with people in the professional government civil service who saw it all going on. Were any pushing back? And specifically, I'm personally wondering around the contracting issue that you write so deeply about.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So I don't think anybody goes into government work to be bad at their jobs. I come in with empathy for government work. We're constantly writing stories that are bashing government, but I do think about the people in those bureaucracies. And for that reason, I include a chapter about the purchasing people who came together in New York City to try to get supplies when they realized the federal government wasn't going to get it done. And they made some mistakes in awarding contracts to people, but they described it to me, and I think this makes sense, as here's a moral dilemma. If I don't get masks to the nurses in the New York City hospitals, people are going to die. So I'm going to start dealing with these joker brokers, as they called them. They put together what they called the GAG team, which stood for I Got a Guy. I talk about this in the book, but they voluntarily started sifting through every claim they got that supplies were coming in. And, they admit to some mistakes in the federal government. The same thing happened. I feel, I feel like the book does a good job of telling you these folks were in an impossible situation. I don't think we can ridicule, people who were put in that position for a couple contracts that went haywire.
Okay. Related to that broader question from Paula, do you think this corruption and mismanagement in a global crisis can and will happen again? Or have we learned anything?
I think there will always be some of that, like I said earlier. But I like to think of the book as a blueprint of what not to do. Let's not make ourselves reliant on mercenaries. And hopefully we will learn, we have learned that lesson. I have to think that there's a serious understanding that we need to have the stockpile, that it's worth it. I think we're seeing some of those things slowly. The politics is kind of getting in the way, but I have hope that we'll be better prepared next time. But I can promise you there's going to be shenanigans in the next one too, and we'll be writing about that.
Very briefly, somebody throws a question my way. Paula asks, why is Elon Musk not really mentioned in Davos Man, other than famously not paying taxes? Were you being literal and he's not part of the Davos group? That said, regarding the pandemic, he did refuse to keep Tesla closed during the entire shutdown, putting his employees at risk. Hey, look, I could have written Davos Man about 25 other people, and Musk would have been a good one. I focused on Bezos and Steve Schwartzman and Larry Fink and Mark Benioff and Jamie Dimon. They tell the same story that lots of other people could have told, and it's a story of billionaires essentially convincing us that we can trust them to fix all of our problems, or, as Benioff famously put it in Davos last year, CEOs are the real heroes of the pandemic. The fact that Musk doesn't pay taxes does certainly make him a Davos man, as does his willingness to tell us that he's saving us from climate change while he's keeping his employees at harm's way. Question from Janet, or really more of a statement, but I'll turn it into a question. I see a movie in this book with vital information, but also an entertaining cast of characters. So, okay, if it's a movie, I could see a movie. I second that. Paging Adam McKay. Who plays you? Who plays Juanita Ramos?
Oh God, who would play me? Believe it or not, I'm not that egotistical that I've thought about that.
So Clooney,
he's a little old
Brad
now.
Pitt. Yeah, I guess
Channing Tatum. I'll go with that. I'd like that.
Okay, right on.
And he's got a good sense of humor.
Well, we're coming up to the end here. I guess I just want to ask you most open-endedly, what would you like us, bigger than anything, to take away from this book? Having gone through this experience of following these fascinating characters, how would you like us to see the world differently than we did going into it?
That's a good question. Well, if you've managed to hold on to some optimism about how we treat each other, I assure you our nature is to be greedy. And this was even worse than you thought in terms of governance. But there is hope. There are heroes. I talk about a few. Other books have been written, like, you make choices. You don't write about Elon Musk, for instance. And this book wasn't about the heroes, so I only include a few. I'm showing you the bad guys of the pandemic. And I'd like you to just sort of see behind the curtain. And, now you know. Yes.
All right. Well, thanks for writing this terrifically engaging book. Thanks for getting deep into it. Thanks to everybody for your questions. And Paula, thanks for throwing this, and back to you.
Thank you for doing it.
Yeah. J. David McSwane, Peter Goodman. I knew I did not oversell this. You two are fantastic. What an interesting conversation. Maybe we'll kind of reverse this. We've done that before, where we've reversed it and had a whole event on Davos Man. And you can put him in the hot seat.
You got my number. Yeah.
But for now, I want to thank our audience for participating. I know we've got a lot of people now, and we'll continue to get people, and for participating with your comments and questions. They were all really good. That doesn't always happen. And thank you for supporting events like this. Please do buy the book from Book Passage, our San Francisco store, Corte Madera store. You can come in safely, or you can order online or call a bookseller on the phone. It's a great way to celebrate the upcoming Independent Bookstore Day on Saturday by supporting Book Passage, your local independent bookstores, and authors like this. I mean, this is how they continue to investigate and write more books like this that we need. So thank you so much for joining us, both to you and also to our audience. Until the next time, be safe, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.